All conditioned things are not self. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering.
Most people walk through life defending a version of themselves that was never really them to begin with. Every conflict, every insecurity, every moment of pain that lingers longer than it should traces back to the same source. And most people never stop long enough to realize what that source actually is. Yet Buddhism identified this source over 2,000 years ago. And what it found will make you deeply uncomfortable, because the version of you that needs to be right, needs to be seen, and needs to be validated is not the real you. It is the thing standing in the way of the real you. Around 500 BC in northern India, a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama walked away from everything. Not because his life was hard, because it was too easy. He had been raised inside a palace, deliberately shielded from the suffering of the outside world by a father who wanted to protect him from it. But the day he finally left those walls and encountered old age, sickness, and death for the first time, something broke open inside him that no amount of comfort could close again. He needed to understand why human beings suffered, not in the abstract, specifically, mechanically. What was the actual process that produced human pain? And he was willing to give up everything he had to find the answer. He spent years studying under the greatest spiritual teachers of his time. He pushed his body to the edge of survival through extreme asceticism, eating almost nothing, sleeping on bare ground, punishing himself in every way the tradition demanded. And he found that none of it worked. The suffering did not end, it just changed shape. So he stopped. He sat down beneath a fig tree in a place called Bodh Gaya, and he made a decision. He would not move until he understood. And after days of sustained and unbroken meditation, something shifted. The thing he had been searching for outside of himself in teachers and traditions and physical discipline was not outside of himself at all. It had been inside all along, and what he found there would become the foundation of one of the most enduring spiritual and philosophical traditions in human history. He did not find God. He did not find a soul. He found something far more unsettling. He found that the self he had been protecting and identifying with his entire life was not what he thought it was. And that misunderstanding, that fundamental case of mistaken identity, was the source of every form of human suffering he had ever witnessed. Buddhism teaches that the ego is not your identity. It is a construction, a story your mind tells itself continuously, built from memories, opinions, desires, fears, and the accumulated judgments of everyone who has ever told you who you are. It feels real because you have been living inside it for so long that you have forgotten it is a story at all, but it is. And like all stories, it requires constant maintenance, constant defense, constant reinforcement. Think about how much of your daily mental energy goes toward that maintenance. The way you replay conversations where you felt disrespected and mentally rehearse what you should have said. The way you monitor how others see you and adjust your behavior based on what you think they are thinking. The way you become disproportionately upset when someone disagrees with your opinion, as though your opinion and your identity were the same thing. The way failure feels not just disappointing but threatening, as though it says something permanent and damning about who you fundamentally are. All of that is the ego at work, not protecting you, protecting itself, and the cost of that protection is enormous. Buddhism has a specific term for the ego and its mechanics. It is called ahamkara in the Sanskrit tradition, often translated simply as the eye maker. The part of the mind that takes every experience and runs it through the filter of me. What does this mean for me? How does this affect me? What does this say about me? The eye maker is not a villain. It is a function, a cognitive habit the mind developed to navigate the world. But when it becomes the dominant lens through which you experience everything, it creates a prison so familiar that most people never notice they are inside it. The Buddhist concept at the heart of this is called Anatta, often translated as non-self, and it is one of the most radical and most misunderstood ideas in the entire history of human thought. Anatta does not mean you do not exist. It does not mean your experiences are not real, or that your feelings do not matter. What it means is that the fixed, permanent, bounded self you believe yourself to be is not actually what you are. You're not a solid, unchanging thing. You're a process, a constantly shifting collection of sensations, thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that arise and pass away in every moment. The self is not a noun, it is a verb. This sounds abstract, but sit with what it actually implies for a moment. If the self is not fixed, then the identity you have been defending so vigorously is not actually at risk when someone challenges it. There is nothing to defend. If you're not a permanent thing but a constantly changing process, then failure does not define you. It is just a moment in the process. If your thoughts and opinions are not who you are, but simply experiences arising in consciousness, then being wrong about something does not threaten your existence. It is just an update. The ego cannot survive this understanding, not because the understanding destroys it, but because the ego only has power in proportion to how seriously you take it. And once you begin to see through the construction, to recognize the eye maker at work, the spell begins to break. Buddhism describes what happens when this spell breaks as ego death, and the term is deliberately dramatic because the experience is. Ego death is not a metaphor for feeling humbled or having a moment of perspective. It is the experiential collapse of the boundary between what you call yourself and everything else. The dissolution of the feeling that there is a separate, defended, isolated you standing apart from the rest of existence and needing to protect itself from it. People who have experienced this through deep meditation, through certain plant medicines, through profound grief or near death, almost universally describe it the same way. First, there is terror, because the ego, sensing its own dissolution, fights back with everything it has. Every fear, every attachment, every identity it has ever constructed gets activated in a last attempt at survival, and then, if you do not run from it, something opens. The terror gives way to something that has no adequate word in English. Peace is too small. Relief is too small. What people describe is more like the removal of a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten it was there. What remains after ego death is not nothing. It is awareness itself, consciousness without the constant commentary of the eye maker, experience without the filter of me, mine, and threatened. This is what Buddhism calls the awakened state, not a reward for being good enough, not a destination you reach after enough spiritual practice, but the natural condition of consciousness when it is no longer being distorted by the ego's constant insistence on its own importance. Now, you may not be seeking full ego death in the Buddhist sense. Most people are not. But the practical implications of this philosophy reach far beyond the meditation cushion and into the texture of ordinary daily life in ways that are immediately and concretely useful. Consider the experience of being criticized. For most people, criticism lands like an attack. The ego registers it as a threat to its survival and responds accordingly. Defensiveness, counterattack, withdrawal, rumination. The criticism gets turned over and over in the mind, not to extract useful information from it, but to build a case against it, to protect the story of who you are from the suggestion that it might need revising. Now consider what happens when the ego loosens its grip even slightly. The criticism arrives, and instead of being filtered through the question of, what does this mean about me? It is met with a different question entirely. Is this true? That is it. Just that. Is there anything accurate here that I can learn from? The defensiveness drops because there is nothing being threatened. The rumination stops because the goal is not protection but understanding, and the information that was previously being rejected as dangerous becomes genuinely useful. This is not a technique. It is what naturally happens when you stop identifying so completely with the ego's construction of who you are. The loosening of that identification does not make you weak or passive or without conviction. It makes you far more effective, because you are no longer spending your energy on defense. You can put it all toward growth. The ego also has a particular relationship with other people that Buddhism identifies as one of the primary sources of human conflict and suffering. The ego needs comparison to exist. It defines itself in relation to others, better than, worse than, more successful than, less respected than. This comparative function is not incidental to the ego. It is structural. The ego cannot know what it is without knowing what it is relative to everything else. This is why other people's success so often produces discomfort, even when it has no direct impact on your own life. This is why being ignored can feel like an attack, even when no hostility was intended. This is why disagreement feels threatening even when the stakes are completely low. The ego is always monitoring, always measuring, always checking to make sure its position in the hierarchy is secure. And that monitoring is exhausting in a way that is so constant and so familiar that most people mistake it for normal. Buddhism does not ask you to stop caring about your life or your growth or your relationships. It asks you to stop using other people as the measuring stick for your own worth. Because as long as your sense of self depends on how you compare to those around you, your peace will always be conditional, always dependent on circumstances you cannot control, always one setback away from collapse. The alternative is what Buddhism calls mudita, often translated as sympathetic joy. The ability to feel genuinely pleased by other people's success without any diminishment of your own. This is only possible when your sense of self is no longer defined by comparison, when you're not in competition with everyone around you for a finite amount of worth. When their having more does not mean you have less. There is a practice in Buddhism called Vipassana meditation that is specifically designed to weaken the ego's grip by teaching you to observe your own experience without identifying with it. You sit, you watch your breath, and when thoughts arise, which they will constantly, you do not engage with them. You do not follow them, argue with them, or try to suppress them. You simply notice them, observe them, and let them pass. This sounds simple. It is one of the most difficult things a human being can attempt, because the ego is extraordinarily skilled at pulling you back into identification. A thought arises, and before you have even registered it consciously, you are already 3 layers deep inside it, planning, defending, catastrophizing, replaying. The practice of Vipassana is the practice of catching that pull earlier and earlier, of creating a gap between the arising of the thought and your identification with it. And in that gap, however small, is the beginning of freedom. What meditators report after sustained practice is not the elimination of thoughts or emotions. It is a fundamental shift in their relationship to them. The thoughts still arise. The emotions still move through, but they are no longer experienced as commands that must be obeyed or threats that must be defended against. They become weather, passing through a sky that remains unchanged by any of it. That sky is what you actually are according to Buddhism. Not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the ego and its endless commentary. The awareness in which all of those things arise and pass away. And once you have touched that even briefly, even for a single moment in a meditation session, or in a moment of profound stillness, the ego's claim to be the totality of what you are begins to feel less convincing. Buddhism also has something precise to say about desire and how the ego uses it to perpetuate suffering. The second of the Four Noble Truths, which form the foundation of Buddhist teaching, states that the origin of suffering is craving. Not desire in general, but the specific quality of clinging. The demand that things be other than they are, the insistence that this experience last forever or that experience never happen again. The ego is the engine of craving, because the ego is always oriented toward a future where it is more secure, more validated, more complete than it is right now. It is structurally incapable of being satisfied with what is. Every achievement becomes the platform for the next desire. Every arrival becomes the beginning of a new seeking. The goalposts are always moving because the ego's survival depends on them moving. A fully satisfied ego would have nothing left to defend. This is why the thing you thought would make you happy so rarely does, at least not for long. The promotion, the relationship, the recognition, the body, the number in the account. Each one delivers a brief sense of completion before the ego reasserts itself and begins generating the next want. Not because you are broken or ungrateful, but because this is exactly how the ego functions. It was never designed to be satisfied. It was designed to persist. Buddhism is not telling you to want nothing. It is pointing to the quality of the wanting. The difference between moving towards something with openness and enthusiasm and clinging to it with the desperate certainty that you cannot be okay without it. The first is engagement with life. The second is suffering. And the only thing that separates them is the ego's involvement. Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, the awakened one, under that tree in Bodh Gaya. And what he spent the remaining decades of his life teaching was not a religion in the conventional sense. It was a diagnosis and a prescription. The diagnosis was that human beings suffer because they mistake the ego for the self. The prescription was a set of practices designed to weaken that identification until it dissolved entirely. He taught for 50 years. He taught kings and servants, scholars and farmers, people in the depths of grief and people at the height of success. And the teaching was always the same at its core. You are not what you think you are. The thing you are protecting is not worth protecting. And what lies beneath it, once you stop defending the construction long enough to look, is something that cannot be threatened, cannot be diminished, and cannot be taken from you by any circumstance the world produces. That is the promise of ego death, not the destruction of who you are, the discovery of what you actually are, underneath everything you were told to be, everything you decided to perform, everything you built to survive a world that rewarded the performance. You do not have to sit in a monastery for 10 years to begin this. You do not have to renounce anything, or adopt a belief system, or change anything visible about your life at all. You only have to begin noticing. Noticing when the ego activates. When the need to be right suddenly feels urgent. When someone else's success produces something uncomfortable. When criticism lands harder than the information in it warrants. When you catch yourself performing for an audience that may not even be watching. Just notice, without judgment, without the secondary ego move of criticizing yourself for having an ego. Simply observe the eye maker at work, see it doing what it does, and in that moment of observation, however brief, you're no longer fully inside it. You are, for that moment, the awareness watching the ego rather than the ego itself. That gap is everything. It is where the peace Buddhism promises actually lives, not in the elimination of the ego, which is neither possible nor necessary, but in the loosening of your identification with it, in the growing recognition that you are not the story. You are the one who can watch the story, and the one who watches has never been threatened by anything the story contains. The ego will tell you that you need it, that without it you will become passive, directionless, without ambition or drive. This is the ego's final and most convincing argument for its own indispensability. It is also completely wrong. What you lose when the ego loosens its grip is not your passion, or your purpose, or your ability to move powerfully through the world. What you lose is the suffering that came with all of it. The anxiety, the comparison, the need for validation, the fear of being wrong, the exhausting maintenance of a self that was never as solid as it claimed to be. What remains is you, clearer, quieter, more present than you have ever been, and completely unthreatened by a world that was never actually trying to destroy you. Only the ego ever believed that it was.